The Salem witch trials remain one of the darkest and most infamous chapters in American history. What began as a small, isolated incident in a tiny Puritan settlement in Massachusetts eventually spiraled into a massive moral panic, leading to the execution of 20 people, most of them women, and the ruin of many more lives. But what caused this tragedy? Was it truly witches threatening the very fabric of society, or was there something deeper at play, something more human, more relatable, something that speaks to the vulnerabilities of a community trapped in fear and superstition? This is the true story behind the Salem witch trials, a tale woven with power, paranoia, and prejudice. In the winter of 1691, in the village of Salem, Massachusetts, a series of strange and unexplained events set the stage for one of the most notorious witch hunts in history. It all began with a group of young girls who began experiencing fits, screaming uncontrollably, and contorting their bodies in ways that defied explanation. These strange behaviors were seen by the local Puritans as signs of demonic possession or witchcraft. The girls, ages 9 to 20, claimed they were being tormented by invisible spirits, and their terrifying outbursts soon escalated, capturing the attention of the entire community. As hysteria spread, it became clear that the Puritans of Salem had no framework for understanding these events. In the rigid, theocratic society they lived in, there was little room for ambiguity. Everything that happened was either a sign from God or a manifestation of the devil's work. Witches, in the eyes of Puritans, were believed to be individuals who had made pacts with Satan, using dark powers to harm others. As these initial fits and cries of torment snowballed, the town's leaders, both religious and civil, began to investigate the situation. They feared that the devil had infiltrated their community, and that the very survival of their society was at risk. At first, accusations were based on the testimonies of the afflicted girls. The girls' descriptions of their tormentors were vague and often contradictory. Yet this was enough for the court to begin arresting women. Among the first accused were Tituba, an enslaved woman of African descent who worked for the Reverend Samuel Parris, and Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, 2 women on the margins of Salem society. Tituba, who was from the Caribbean, was immediately seen as an outsider, and the cultural differences she represented made her an easy target for suspicion. She eventually confessed under pressure, naming others she claimed were involved in witchcraft, and her confession only fueled the flames of panic. Her testimony, combined with the emotional outbursts of the young girls, created a fertile ground for more accusations to grow. As the trials continued, the atmosphere in Salem became more charged. The court, led by Judge Samuel Sewell and Chief Judge William Stoughton, was less concerned with the actual evidence and more focused on the confessions and the terrifying testimonies of those who claimed to be afflicted. The trials were often based on little more than spectral evidence, accusations that the spirit of a person had tormented the afflicted, even when the person was nowhere near them. This form of evidence was highly problematic and deeply unscientific, yet it became the cornerstone of many of the convictions. People were condemned based on nothing more than accusations, and the words of the accusers were taken as gospel. It was a climate of fear and uncertainty where anyone could be accused, and few had the power to defend themselves. What made the Salem witch trials particularly disturbing was the sheer number of people involved. The accusations soon spread beyond the immediate circle of the young girls and their families. Neighbors turned against neighbors, friends betrayed friends, and even family members accused one another of witchcraft. The trials, which initially focused on a small group of women, expanded to include men, children, and the elderly. The ever-expanding list of suspects included people from all walks of life, some with no apparent connection to the initial hysteria. The accusations were often random, targeting people who were seen as different or who had somehow fallen out of favor with their neighbors. One of the more tragic aspects of the trials was the way in which social and personal grievances were often settled through accusations of witchcraft. If someone had a long-standing dispute with a neighbor, it wasn't unusual for them to accuse that neighbor of witchcraft in order to rid themselves of a problem. This deeply cynical exploitation of the witch trials reflected how personal vendettas could be disguised as religious zeal, and how the trials themselves became an instrument of power. Many of those accused were seen as weak or vulnerable, and their social status or lack thereof made them easy targets. Women, in particular, were the most likely to be accused, but men, too, were not exempt from suspicion. As the trials continued into the spring and summer of 1692, the death toll began to rise. The accused were subjected to brutal interrogations and forced to confess under duress. Some were pressed to death with large stones, others were hanged, and several died in jail while awaiting trial. The fear that gripped Salem was almost palpable, as the once thriving village became consumed by paranoia. The question of who would be next to face the terrifying court was on everyone's mind. Meanwhile, the religious leaders in the community struggled to justify the trials, and their responses were often contradictory. They believed that the trials were necessary to protect the community from evil, but they also began to realize the catastrophic consequences of the hysteria they had helped fuel. As the trials reached their peak, some voices began to speak out against the madness. Reverend Increase Mather, one of the leading ministers in Massachusetts, and the father of the more famous Cotton Mather, expressed doubts about the validity of the trials and the use of spectral evidence. He argued that it was dangerous to convict people based on the visions of young girls and the testimony of the accused under duress. His criticism of the proceedings helped to shift public opinion, but it came too late to save the many lives that had already been destroyed. The end of the Salem witch trials came in the fall of 1692. When the mass hysteria began to fade and people began to question the legitimacy of the trials, public opinion turned against the court and the methods it had used. In 1693, the governor of Massachusetts, William Phips, intervened, halting the trials and later declaring that the convictions based on spectral evidence were not valid. The damage, however, had already been done. The hysteria that had gripped Salem left deep scars on the community and on the broader colonial society. The trials destroyed lives, ruined reputations, and tarnished the reputation of the Puritan faith. It was a tragedy that could have been avoided if the people of Salem had been more skeptical, more rational, and less willing to succumb to fear and superstition. Looking back at the Salem witch trials, we see not just a tragic episode of history, but also a powerful lesson in the dangers of mass hysteria, scapegoating, and the abuse of power. It serves as a reminder of how fear can quickly spiral out of control, how communities can be torn apart by unfounded accusations, and how vulnerable people can be used as pawns in larger social and political struggles. The Salem witch trials are not just a relic of the past, but a cautionary tale that continues to resonate in the modern world. In times of fear and uncertainty, we must remember the lessons of Salem and be vigilant against the dangers of witch hunts, both literal and metaphorical. The Salem witch trials were not simply about witches. They were about power, fear, and human nature. They were a reflection of the ways in which societies grapple with the unknown, the unexplainable, and the uncomfortable. And as we look back on this tragic chapter of history, we must ask ourselves, what lessons have we learned, and how can we prevent such madness from happening again? In the end, the true story behind the Salem witch trials is not just about witches. It is about us, the people, the societies, and the systems of belief that shape our world. It is a story of how easily we can be swayed by fear and superstition, and how important it is to remain grounded in reason, compassion, and justice, even in the face of uncertainty and fear. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the Salem witch trials, don't forget to subscribe for more fascinating historical stories. Like, share, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.